Hey race fans, welcome to my shop again. In this episode of Hanging with the Z-Man, we're going to show you a few things on the front end of the car that we do normal maintenance to, as well as show you kind of the different components on the front end, and also do some motor maintenance as we do it when we change the oil and stuff like that, just stay on top of things. Let's get to work. I'm going to show you some components on the front end now. It's kind of made up of several different parts here, but mainly we got the upper control arm and the lower control arm with a spindle assembly tied in between them, with ball joints on the upper and lower control arms. As far as maintenance goes, there's a couple different points on the front end that we focus on. It's just as simple as greasing the upper control arm ball joint and the lower control arm ball joint. And then the control arms are bolted to the chassis with Hangins, and we just choose to lube those. There's other products out there that you can get that are Teflon coated and stuff that you don't have to lube, but we just like to. We're up here doing maintenance, so we can lube those while we're up here. We've got the brake assembly, brake caliper, rotor. A lot of you see these on cars. It's a pretty simple deal. Just a couple brake pads here, clamps down on the rotor. That's what helps us stop. There are different brake pad compounds that we use. We choose to use AFCO brake caliper, which has been a real good piece for me this year. It's a new piece. I recommend you try those. As far as going back to suspension, we've got an Eibach spring here. Eibach has been helping us out here for a couple years, and I feel like their product is pretty superior. They're right on rates, and they're great to work with, and I wouldn't probably run anything other than Eibach at this point. So other than that, we got your shock, weight jack adjustment to adjust ride height, and you can put wedge, take wedge out, do stuff like that. You get your tie rod assembly up here that ties together with other stuff that we'll show you here in a second, connected with the spindle bolt. That pretty much covers the whole right front suspension on a modified. Coming off the right front suspension, we talked about the tie rod assembly. On the front end, there's essentially 6 components that we can talk about here. Number 1 is right front tie rod that I showed you in the other episode. Left front tie rods, number 2. You got your pitman arms, number 3. Idler arms, number 4. Center links, number 5. And the most important is your steering sector, steering box, number 6. That is probably, like I said, the most important part on the front end, because it's what steers the car. But basically, the center link is tied together with the idler arm and the pitman arm, and then your tie rods are connected to the center link, and that's what ties all the front steering components together. The steering box, there's different ratios you can get. This box here is an 8-to-1 box built by Sweet, which means 8 turns here to 1 turn here. There's different ratios. Some drivers prefer different ratios, but this is the one that I chose, and it works pretty good for me. Right now we're going to show you one of the important maintenance procedures that we do on these USMTS engines. Right here I've got a Sputz racing engine. It's a spec head motor. What I do every 2 nights is, or when I change the oil, which is about every 2 to 3 nights, I'll run the valves and check the lash on the valve train. When you got a good engine builder like Sputz, it makes it pretty nice to check your valves, and usually nothing's ever off or anything like that, but it's important to check just in case of any issues that may happen with bearings or push rods or anything on the valve train itself. But Sputz makes it nice. He stamps the valve lash on the intake, which makes it simple to just set your feeler gauge up and run through your valves, and I'll show you that right now. Okay, we're at the Sputz spec head USMTS engine here now. We're at the top end. Right here we got the valve cover. This is where our valve train is located underneath here. There's 4 studs here. I've already taken the nuts and the washers off. You also have this breather system, which is a hose connected to the front of the valve cover. It's used for to relieve crankcase pressure, for not blowing out seals and stuff like that. So take the valve cover off, set it up here on the deck. I'll explain a little bit of what's going on underneath here. we took the valve cover off. We got this nice Pro gasket that keeps the oil in the engine, keeps everything nice and clean. There are cheaper ones out there. Don't want to mess with that. Just get the good ones, and then you won't have any trouble. Moving on to the valve train components is just some of them. Some of them you can't see. Camshafts located down inside the engine, lifters, push rods you can't see. We'll focus here on the shaft drive system. This is what they call a shaft drive rocker arm system. There's different kinds of rocker arm systems out there. This one is the most bulletproof in my opinion. Some sanctions don't allow you to run these, but basically what you got is you've got a stand that bolts to the head. You've got the shaft that runs in between the intake and the exhaust rocker arm, which are on bearings, and the shaft itself sits down in a nice radiused groove on the stand. 3 bolts, 3 studs here. That whole set comes off on each cylinder. This is an 8-cylinder engine, so there's 4 sets on each side. But basically you got your intake, or you got your exhaust, you got your intake, you got your valve springs here and here with the valve retainers and keepers, which holds the valve on to the spring. Other than that, that pretty much kind of covers the whole underneath the valve train. We'll go over kind of how I adjust the lash on the valves, which is the distance between the roller tip on the rocker arm and the tip of the valve. The last tool that I have here is a remote starter button, which helps me bump over the engine outside the cockpit. I don't have to actually be inside the cockpit or have somebody else do it for me. I can do it myself from this location here, which is nice, so we don't get miscommunications or something like that. So this will help me bump over the engine. I'll show you now how I adjust the valves themselves on this cylinder, which is #1 cylinder on this V8. This is a Chevy. Some guys run Fords, just to throw that in there, but majority of the USMTS engines are Chevrolet engines. You got the exhaust valve here, or exhaust rocker here. You kind of have to go back and forth between the rocker arms to set the opposite one. So what we do is we bump it over till the exhaust just starts to open. So you bump it over, and then you check the intake. I can see there that it's a little loose, so I want to tighten that up. So I'll show you with my LSM tool how I loosen the nut on the top. Just loosen it up, turn your Allen wrench just a little bit, bring that down to where it's just torques. Then I got a nice valve lash right there on the specification that I want. That was the intake rocker arm that we just set there. Now we're going to move to the exhaust rocker arm. So what you want to do is look at the intake now. Now this might be confusing to you, bouncing back and forth, but this is really the only way to do it on this particular application with the roller cam setup. So you want to take this rocker arm to where it opens all the way up. And then when it starts to close, you want to keep a hold of this rocker arm, the intake, bring it all the way up till it just gets lash, and then you want to check your exhaust. When you have that to where you want it, that's how you set each cylinder, and you go through the whole side, the other side, the same exact way.
Hey everybody, Chris here again. So when Zach's working on the top end of the engine like he just showed you, setting the valve train, I'm typically up front working on what he was showing you earlier on the front suspension. So lubing the center link, the tie rods, and the A-frames. Lube that, get it cleaned up, and then the next thing we do is check the radiator. So depending on track conditions, if we're running in a part of the country that happens to be really rainy, or they overwater the tracks, the radiator gets filled up with mud in between the fins. So what we'll do is take our AFCO radiator completely out, soak it with water, and let that mud and dirt get good and wet, and then blow it out with an air hose. Wanted to kind of show you a cool tip, I guess you can use with a simple, cheap funnel on how to refill that radiator, and Zach's going to show you that now.
Well, by the way, thank you for doing the work that you do up front. That really helps me out, and it's also important. This is important, setting the valves, but you do good work. So, you have anything?
Well, I was just going to say, a lot of people just do the lube up front, and they just leave the lube kind of hanging off the zerts, and I like to clean all that up. So for all the other drivers out there that get grease and bits and pieces on their visor, and that's not from me. That's not from the 33Z ever.
Yep, that's good. That's a good point, and he does a good job at that. But anyway, here's the funnel he was talking about. This has a similar attachment to your radiator cap. It just goes on there. It's got the same two tabs. You just put it on there. Do your quarter turn. It's tight. Then you put your water in there. What I usually do is fill this up and leave a fitting loose on the top of the intake, whether it's your tip sender or a fitting or whatever. That helps bleed the air out of the system. And with this being so high above the whole system, this is the highest point, so it gets most of the air out of the system way better than if you're just filling right at the top of the radiator. So once you see water coming out of the fitting, you tighten that up, top this off, let it bubble for a little bit, let any more air get out of there. We'll fire the engine, let it suck down the remaining amount of water that it needs. Then I'll actually put this little stopper back in there, which keeps the water in the funnel. Take this off, drain the water into your jug or whatever, put your radiator cap back on, and then we're ready to go.
Well, that wraps up the second episode of Hanging with the Z-Man. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks to all of our sponsors to help make this possible. And you can find Zach on Facebook at facebook.com/Zach Vanderbeek Racing. You can also find Zach on Twitter at Zach Vanderbeek. See you soon.